Morning, everyone. My name is Kyle Samani. I'm a co-founder of a crypto hedge fund here in Austin, actually, called Multicoin Capital. I'm excited to be here at Refactor Camp. I will start off my presentation by saying it will be the exact opposite of the prior presentation. In general, I have very little background in the history of money and all this economic theory stuff. I've probably spent 1/100th the time that Brett has spent on those issues. I have a very different lens for how I think about what are these things, why will they be valuable, and what will win. In this presentation, the only kind of really thing I will actually forecast with any reasonable certainty is the order of magnitude by which I think the size of the winner is. That order of magnitude is in the title of the presentation, tens of trillions, dollars. So it's kind of the only thing I really forecast. Everything else I have no idea, but this presentation will provide some frameworks on how we kind of think, how I think about how some of these issues how some of these protocols might become worth tens of trillions of dollars. I also happen to have written a blog post with the same title about a month or two ago. So if you want to read that, that's on our website at multicoin.capital. All right, so let's kick it off. So there are kind of three fundamental hypotheses on what type of token could become worth tens of trillions of dollars, or the path to get there, I should say. All of these in this future end state of the world are a store of value. At a minimum, they are digital gold. They may be digital cash as well, but at a minimum are digital gold. And so the kind of question is what are the paths to get there? So one is the store of value hypothesis. This kind of hypothesis basically states that the token or the protocol that becomes worth that much money doesn't really need to be very functional. It just needs to perform a very basic set of tasks. And those tasks, is that the next slide? Yeah, okay, sorry. I'll dive into that. The second hypothesis is what I call the utility hypothesis. So this hypothesis basically states the thing that will become worth tens of trillions will be the most useful, and as it becomes used by more and more people along the way, that will make it valuable. This is the exact opposite view of the store value right view, which is just make sure it works and it doesn't get hacked and doesn't get broken, and that's it. And then the third hypothesis is technically a subset of the second hypothesis, but it's worth breaking out as its own, and that's the stablecoin hypothesis. And that hypothesis basically states, look guys, you're all kidding, the only way these things ever become useful is if they're price stable, because no one will ever use them or store wealth in them if they're not. And so it has to be price stable along the way, and that's the path to becoming the super, super mega winner. So for the rest of this presentation, I'll just dive into each of these three hypotheses, talk about the kind of ideas in each one. Total full disclosure, I'm a big believer in hypothesis number 2, the utility hypothesis. Cool, so the store value hypothesis basically states that all you really need is sound money, and sound money in the very conservative sense of the word basically just means Austrian economics. So fixed money supply, no inflation, or maybe a predictable inflation schedule, but preferably no inflation at all. And kind of sort of you only need a really few features in the system to make it work, and the bar is actually pretty low. Those features are self-sovereign, right? So that means you should be able to control your own money, and you shouldn't have to rely on a third party. Obviously, all kind of crypto tokens solve that problem. It has to be censorship resistant. Again, pretty straightforward. You want to make sure that no government or anyone can stop you from accessing or spending your capital. The third kind of concept here is that it has to be secure, and this means in kind of multiple senses of the word. It means it needs to be easy for you to store it, as a person, so you shouldn't need to lug around a bunch of bars of gold and be worried about them being robbed. But it also means technically secure, you don't want to worry about your multi-sig contract blowing up and losing all of your money, right? So you want to make sure that the money will always be accessible no matter what happens in the world around you. And then the fourth is obviously it needs to be scarce. And so the believers of the store value hypothesis really are look, just give me these four things, and everything else doesn't really matter. It's nice if you can have other things, but if those other things come at the expense of any of these four, then it's incorrect, because you just need to maximize these four. Bitcoin is is the furthest of all the major kind of cryptos out there, is the one that most espouses the store value hypothesis. In particular, the real focus on no new features, right? No smart contracts, maximal decentralization, even at the expense of scalability, no privacy. They're just no, just make sure the damn thing works. There's 21 million of them, and that's kind of it. And hopefully we scale with Lightning. Who knows if that will really work? But just like make sure the damn thing works. And like that's basically the view. And like their view is like as people, you know, as Austrian economics is like the right view of the world because inflation is evil. And like over time, all of the world will gravitate to this kind of view. And like that's the right answer. And that's basically the store value hypothesis. Make sense generally? Yes? Cool. So let's dive into the utility hypothesis. So this hypothesis is basically the exact opposite, which basically says don't prescribe any notion of like what features matter or don't matter. Like don't have any views of like what has worked in the history of money or not. Just make a thing that people fucking use. And like that's it. And so make it as useful as possible. And like that's kind of sort of all you need. Most people who believe in the utility hypothesis tend to believe in a predictable inflation schedule that cannot be manipulated easily. And the reason is inflation gives you some good usability features, which I'll dive into in a second. But really, like, no, don't prescribe at all what features matter other than just get people to use it. So in the utility hypothesis, like, there's a whole bunch of like features in these systems that are like at the protocol layer that matter or don't matter depending on your view. So one is formal governance, right? So like Tezos and Dash, EOS, all of these systems have very formal on-chain governance. And you can argue this is a form of utility. If we're gonna have this like global wealth money thing, like some people say there should be a very formal mechanism within the protocol itself that governs upgrades to the protocol, that governs maybe arbitration of disputes, if you want to support arbitration. Other people are like, nah, just like have some off-chain system where like people kind of talk about it and like the leaders kind of make a decision and most people move on with it, right? Ethereum kind of falls more in that bucket for now. A lot of teams these days think it's kind of innovative and it's valuable to really formally specify these things and have basically a constitution. And like, how about the idea there is like, well, if we're gonna have the global money thing, people need to feel like they have control in the system, right? And in proof of work mining, you don't really have any control unless you're a miner. So inflation is a really powerful concept. Right? If you think about these systems, like, right, you need to prevent double spends in all of these systems, and like, you need miners or like block producers or someone has to secure the network. There are fundamentally two ways to pay for network security. You have to pay these people to maintain the network. One is transaction fees and the other is inflation. There are no other known models to compensate people who maintain the network that I'm aware of. And so like, again, if you move towards a disinflationary or fixed supply system, then like transaction, right, the system has to be paid for in transaction fees. And that can become very, very, very expensive for end users. So if you use inflation, you can make the system free to end users to transact. And there's obviously a lot of good data that people like free things, that people don't like feeling fees. Obviously the counter is, well, you are feeling the fees because there's inflation and like you're losing purchasing power. But most people don't really perceive this. Turns out people like the US dollar despite the fact that the government prints money. Right, and so there's kind of a powerful idea of like, look, use inflation to make the system as accessible as possible. Also use inflation to justify having higher hardware requirements for the people who maintain the networks themselves. And if you compensate them better, then they can have bigger computers, which means the system can do more transaction throughput, right? So there's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy there of like, inflate everybody and make the system better for everybody, and it's actually kind of a collective benefit for everybody. Some of the other kind of features that people in the utility hypothesis like to talk about are throughput and latency, transaction fee. I guess that's kind of related to inflation here, right? But these are pretty important. Turns out if you're gonna have a thing that 7 billion people are gonna use, you probably need to like have pretty high transaction throughput. People today, like say Visa is I think 30, 40, 50,000 transactions per second is like kind of peak, like Christmas time or whatever. I think that's thinking like way too small. A, Visa and MasterCard don't support most of the world population. But then B, if you like make these systems work at global scale and like have them automated and have machines plugged into them and everything, I suspect that like transaction throughput would be on the order of 10 million transactions per second or more. So I mean like you need to be really thinking about like massive, massive scale that's well beyond anything that we have today. So you know, how do you get there and how do you make it useful to get to that end state of the world? And then like the fourth kind of just category of like types of features that people in the kind of debate about within the utility hypothesis are what I'll call kind of expressivity within the language itself, the programmability, and kind of formal verification, which is kind of related. So the idea is, right, like in Ethereum, technically there are smart contracts. It's like the pay to script hash stuff. Like you can embed logic in there. The logic is pretty primitive. The like level of ways you can program in it are like it's limited, it's challenging, it's a pretty low level. Most developers like who learn JavaScript and like Go and like Swift and stuff, like Bitcoin script language is like pretty shitty. Like no one really likes working in it. It's a very not expressive language. The like more modern languages are higher level, more expressive. They do more things for you automatically. On the other hand, typically like the more stuff you do, the more attack surface there is in the system, and like the more attack surface there is in the system, like your money might explode. So like that's kind of a fundamental risk there. The kind of interesting caveat to that is this concept called formal verification. The folks at Tezos really like to talk about this a lot, but basically the idea is there are certain things you can, depending on how you structure the language and the code, there's certain ways you can actually write proofs that basically you run the code itself through an algorithm, and that algorithm can mathematically assert that your code does or does not do a handful of things. It is not like the cure-all, end-all, be-all for avoiding all bugs and all explosions, but like it can help avoid some bugs and some explosions. It's really not, I haven't seen any good literature on like the exact bounds and like how useful it will be in practice. A lot of people like to say like this is the answer to everything. We can't have a money system without formal verification. By the way, nothing in the current financial system has any formal verification, so just FYI. Your Tesla probably doesn't either. Rocket ships do, nuclear power plants do, airplanes do, but like most systems in the world do not really get formally verified. So kind of TBD, like how much of that we really need in these systems. My point in talking about all of these is not to say that any of these one features matter or don't matter. Rather, like, and these aren't even arguably features. You could argue these are kind of more like just like ideologies. Like what do you want in your money thing or not want in your money thing? And like I have no idea what the right answers are. There's a lot of smart people building lots of systems that have different ideas about like on these different sets of trade-offs, like what the right answer should or should not be. But like all of these things here, like fundamentally kind of create risk relative to like these four concepts here. They don't necessarily have to be mutually, they're not mutually exclusive, but like on the like range of like outcomes, these kind of types of things tend to create more problems in like guaranteeing that basic level of functionality. So the utility hypothesis is kind of much more fundamentally aggressive of like, no, listen, like the money thing needs to be as amazing as possible and like get people to use it, whereas the store value hypothesis is like, nah man, just make sure the thing doesn't break. Make sense? I guess the other one I should have added on here is like privacy. Privacy is obviously a big deal, right? There's other kinds of these types of elements. These are by no means like the only four traits to think through, but these are some of the more frequently talked about ones. Okay, and then the stablecoin hypothesis. So this hypothesis basically says get people to use it, and like there will be more of them. The kind of key is to have some sort of algorithmic inflation schedule to like make the thing work. So like this kind of concept is called, generally it's called seigniorage shares. The idea, right, the kind of problem conceptually is if you have a free-floating currency, how do you make sure it maintains a stable price? Anyone who's studied economics for more than 5 minutes will tell you this is impossible, and like there are no examples of this in history that have ever worked. Despite the like strong amount of economic evidence suggesting this is impossible, there are lots of smart people who think it may be possible. Who knows? But like if you think about it, if you're gonna have a stable currency, you like need to control the supply. So like if the price goes up, you need to print more of them. And if the price goes down, you need to remove them from the system, right, supply. And so like printing money, it turns out is pretty easy. You can just print money and like increase supply and reduce, bring the price down. The harder part is reducing supply, because like you can't take money away from people. Like that's pretty shitty. And so the different kind of people building stablecoin systems have different ideas on how to incentivize rational actors to remove supply from the system. That typically involves like being compensated more in the future. These systems are by definition like recursive, and like there's a prophecy, like you're only gonna rationally remove your supply from the system if you believe you will get more later. So the whole things are built on the idea of like everyone believes in it, which again, who the fuck knows if it'll work. But like that's kind of the general idea with these systems. And if you do actually get a price stability, then like that's pretty cool, because now you can like shop with it and stuff, right? Okay, so yeah, the price stability hypothesis, like I used to be more bullish on it like 6 months ago, and the more time we spent on it internally, the more I've come to the realization that I don't think it can ever work at scale. If you think about like the 2008 financial crisis, like the reason it happened is because people were like, no, let's like take all these like large amounts of debt and like tranche them up into these CDO things and have like these different categories of debt, and like then they kind of screwed up rating the debt, but like we just like took these this debt systems and like broke it up into the volatile parts and the stable parts, and like tried to like market them and like sell them off in different pieces. And like a stablecoin is literally that. Is like, oh, like we have a free floating currency that's like volatile in price. Let's like create the stable part and then let's have the volatile part. And like these systems, like in human history, we have very strong evidence that suggests they will explode at some point. So I'm not a huge fan of this hypothesis, but hey, like lots of smart people are trying. The kind of interesting thing about like these two hypotheses is like how their like views come out in the real world. So like in the real, like the Bitcoin maximalists are like pretty vocal on the internet. There's like this concept called like hyper-Bitcoinization. If you want to read about it, it's pretty interesting. There's a friend of mine, his name is Murad. He lives in New York. He likes to talk about it a lot. But like the Bitcoin maximalists are really like one coin to rule them all. Like, no, listen, it has to be sound money. Like, there's no other way. Like, there is a rational, perfect definition of sound money, and like this must be the way. And like all these little altcoins are like stupid because like you're just kidding yourselves with all these silly features. Like, you just need fucking gold, and like the government's evil and like inflates your currency, and like no, like this is the way the world should be. That tends to be kind of the Bitcoin view. It's actually remarkably prescriptive if you think about it, and it's a very narrow view of the world. This view is also very much rooted in like looking at the history of the world and like looking at the history of money and what makes good money, what makes bad money, looking at like how governments and currencies have fallen. And it's very much drawn from like large views of history and like says like, aha, this is the right, best way, you know, the world should be moving forward. The other view is like, and this is the view I take, is like I have no conception of like what the right answer is. I basically want to let the free market decide. My intuition is that most rational, normal people don't give a shit about like hyper-Bitcoinization or like Bitcoin maximalism or any of these things. And like they're gonna want the money thing, and it's like no transaction fees and like enables them to do cool apps and like whatever the hell else they want to do. And they want it to be fast and free and whatever, right? And so like basically let the market decide. And so it's just kind of interesting if you think about these two views, is like the Bitcoin view is the store of value is very top down, saying like this is the way the world should be. And the utility hypothesis view is fundamentally not. It's just like, I don't know, like just build stuff and like see what happens. So it's just kind of very interesting to recognize that, and I don't think this is appreciated enough in kind of the general discourse between the like utility hypothesis maximalists and the store of value maximalists, is that like, in one sense, the utility people are like the more aggressive ones, because they're saying like, no, like the history of money is like not as relevant as you think it is, and like there will be some new better way forward that may have inflation in it and whatever, and maybe technically riskier. And like, so in one sense it's more aggressive, but in another sense, the store of value view is actually much more aggressive because it's just a much narrower view, a much narrower set of outcomes. And I don't think this is appreciated enough. I will say like, you know, like Brett who was before me was talking about like how to think about all these systems in a very like top-down way, and like, right, like how the world should be or shouldn't be, all these ways to analyze it. I find those types of top-down analytics to be, or analysis to be very helpful to like describe the past and understand, but I find it to be very not helpful to predict the future. Because like these systems are just so complex, and you've got 7 billion people and like all these, like no one can really forecast the outcomes of that. So I tend to have a pretty strong bias towards the bottoms up view of just like get people to use the thing, and like that will become the winner. Yeah, I guess a couple of last things. I touched on these a little bit, but I think, you know, if you're gonna argue against sound money, like that generally sounds like a stupid idea. Like who wants to be like, no, not sound money is the best money. Like that sounds pretty stupid. But there are actually quite rational arguments against not sound money. The first is inflation to subsidize transaction fees. I touched on this a little bit. But like if you're gonna transact like 10 million transactions per second, like you need a lot of computers, and you need a lot of very powerful computers to do this. Like that's just a fact. And like someone has to pay for those computers. You can pay for those with transaction fees, or you can pay with those with inflation. If you have inflation, you can pay the people to maintain the system. And I think that's quite beneficial. EOS is kind of like the most probably prominent example of this today. EOS is gonna have 21 block producers. Each block producer is gonna make a lot of money. And like they will have big computers and data centers to like process all the transactions. Transactions will take like a couple of seconds to clear, and like the system will launch supporting thousands of transactions per second with a pretty clear path to scale to much more than that. Transaction fees to users will be free, which is pretty compelling. Like turns out people don't like paying transaction fees. So kind of interesting. The second kind of concept against sound money is that price stability is more important. I think that's kind of the idea of stable coins, right? I think this third one is a little more interesting. This is not talked about enough. The Austrian economics view, in my opinion, is quite rigid. It's also very rooted in like me, and like, right? The idea is like, no, it's evil to like inflate, like print money because you're like reducing my purchasing power, and like it's evil to do that. I find that like the reality of the world is like the world is very unequal, and like people are born in different places, and like we have collective commons and stuff because like not everyone has the same opportunities, and it's like not everyone's born with like the same access and privileges. And so like I just kind of struggle with the Austrian view of the world because it's like extremely rigid. And I just suspect that like if you're going to actually have 7 billion people like trying to use this thing, like just such a rigid system is probably not going to work. And then like I think the other argument against sound money is like everything else is programmable. Like at first it sounded crazy 5 years ago to say your car will be programmable. Now we all more or less kind of think that will happen. Planes, rockets, right? Like doors, like fucking everything is kind of doorbells, like, right? Everything is becoming programmable, and if you use the software, I think it's just kind of stupid to argue that like money won't be, or like a way to store value won't be, even though that fundamentally introduces technical risk of like your money explodes. I just like everything else is becoming programmable, so like why won't money? And like the argument is, well, it's too important, and I'm like, well, everyone else said that about everything else. That like our cars, you know, like we've got cars exploding gas in like cylinders, and like that's programmable now. So, you know, who knows? Cool. So that's the presentation. I'm happy to dive into questions and thoughts on this stuff.
Stablecoin hypothesis, do you always equate to an actual currency? Like to a USD, a CAD? Is that how you define a stablecoin?
Yeah, so the question is like, if you have a stablecoin, what is it stable to price? So most of the stablecoins being worked on today are price stable relative to US dollars. You could obviously realize that's kind of silly because like the government, the Fed like inflates the currency, and like this seems to not be supportive of the general crypto view of the world. The idea in the long run is like, for now, use USD as like the idea because it's globally recognized. As all the stablecoin folks kind of say, over time, as the system matures, they'll eventually do some sort of like basket of goods CPI style thing. None of them have defined what that will be. To be fair, like it's just too early to bother to do that.
I see it as like a vestige of traditional finance still finding its way into the crypto markets, and they're proliferating because people don't want to use fiat on crypto exchanges.
Yeah, I don't have a good sense for like what the breakup of demand is. I don't know.
Talking about people adopting one of these technologies, do you envision individuals, institutions, corporations, entrepreneurs, governments, or a mix, and what thoughts on what the sequence would be? It seems like they have different requirements from technology.
Yeah, so the question is like, there's different stakeholders who are adopting these things at different paces. Consumers, businesses, governments, institutions, whatever. They all definitely have requirements, right? Like the lowest bar is like consumers, which is why like the first people to mine Bitcoin were like random people because they were like, I want some Bitcoins. And we're all just now getting to the point where like endowments and foundations and other like large, like big funds with liabilities and stuff are getting into this. In general, like the lowest bar is consumers, and then probably businesses, and then probably institutions. And we're just now starting to see institutions getting on board.
Kyle, I got a question for you, man. I also stole the mic. Sorry, everybody. So I really like the way that you break everything down, and I think I agree with almost all of the categorizations that you make. But I have like one minor issue, I feel, with one kind of contrast that you've been curious for your comment. So you talk about sound money-based projects as sort of top-down, and then utility-based projects as sort of bottom-up. And that strikes me as a little curious. Like, I'm not a Bitcoin maximalist, certainly not in the sort of cartoonish way that you described, which I think is very fair, and there are a lot of people out there that do say those things and believe those things, which I think is silly. But I think there's a more nuanced, perhaps, approach to Bitcoin maximalism, shall we say, in which one views sound money as actually a base layer, and that there are all these other things that will get built on top of it. And you can question, you can argue, you can say the Lightning is not going to work, and it's you know, broken in principle, and that's fine. Like, there can be doubts about whether those layers will be effective. But it feels like the nuanced Bitcoin maximalist approach is start with sound money, since that's the root of everything, build up many, many more layers inductively as each one below it starts to take off. And I would categorize that as much more of a bottoms-up approach. Whereas utility tokens, the idea of, can I just invent a use case, put it out there, and let's see what the market decides, is almost like engineering a product in a vacuum top-down approach. So I feel almost like those labels are backwards, and I'm just curious how you conceptualize that.
So that's a fair way to categorize it. So basically, kind of Drew is arguing that my categorization of top-down, bottom-up is backwards. So I should have clarified this at the beginning of the presentation. I'm really only referring here to like layer 1 stuff. So like all the ERC20 tokens like aren't relevant for any of this at all. This is all like base layer. So Bitcoin, Ethereum, Definity, Tezos, EOS, like layer 1 stuff. So not as worried about kind of the utility tokens generally. Except for layer 1s. We could get into a debate around like layer 1 versus layer 2. My intuition is that like basically you can have all of these in layer 1, and like I think you can have all of them safely. You can have your cake and eat it too. There's a couple of things that like at the very limits of like the FLP impossibility theorem that like you can't have everything perfectly all the way, but like I think we can get to 99% of the way there of everything we want in layer 1. It's just like hard, and we're not there yet. But I don't see any reason why we won't get there. We can come back to the like lightning debate and like challenges of layering these systems.
What do you see as a productive engagement between a creation of a currency like this and the governments of the world? Because something that I've seen with the LCOs, and I think we've all seen, is that there was no envisioning of what a productive relationship or congruence or coming together of our current currency systems and LCOs were. So do you see anything that are characteristics of a coin that could make it where it meshes with government operations and isn't a clash at some point, or do you think that's going to be an issue ever?
So kind of question is like governments versus crypto is kind of the question. So you've got kind of two fundamental kinds of chains. You've got public permissionless chains and you've got permission chains. So public permissionless chains, like by definition, or like governments don't like interfere with them, or at least like unless they're attacking them. But like by definition, they operate out of the bounds of government. And like it's pretty clear that public permissionless chains will screw with a lot of governments. It's like not going to happen in like Western democracies that are like stable anytime soon. But like Argentina, Venezuela, these kinds of places, like I expect in the next 5 years we will see crypto challenge the legitimacy of some government somewhere. I think it will happen a lot sooner than people think. So that will definitely happen. On the converse side is like governments are obviously, like the Chinese government, the Russian government have like said like, hey, these blockchain things are like a cool way to manage our like money supply. And like the central banks, like what if we just have Fed coin or like US dollar coin? And like that will probably happen, but like that's not really comparable to these systems because like the central bank will still print money whenever it wants to, and like it'll be still subject to the whims of politicians and stuff. So like that's just a technically better version of like the banking system we have now, but it's not actually like different at all. And like this stuff will screw with governments. The best thing a government can do is buy Bitcoin and like buy Ethereum. And like there are some sovereign wealth funds, like I think like the Norwegian ones, and like I think maybe in like Abu Dhabi, Dubai, I think they're like buying Bitcoin. And they're just like sitting on it. I think the Belgian government, they have like $4 billion of Bitcoin. But it was like, they like stole it in like a drug heist or something, and like they just haven't sold it. And like they're sitting on a lot of Bitcoin.
Hey Kyle, so I notice you use the term inflation to refer to an increase in the number of tokens, which actually then implies that deflation is a decrease in the number of tokens. And this is like an idiosyncratic way of framing this, because inflation would traditionally be called the decrease in the purchasing power of tokens. And you can have situations where you increase the supply of tokens without decreasing their purchasing power. So I just want to know, like, in what sense are you using that term inflation? Because I know within Austrian economics, they're often used to mean the same thing, because the idea is that like you kind of just, it is one and the same thing. But can you just like elaborate on like what precisely you're referring to when you refer to inflation? And also then like the idea that most cryptos right now de facto are priced in US dollars and fiat currency. So you had that quote there which said, let the market decide what money is. All right, which that quote implies this belief that markets can exist without money, because then you're going to use the market to decide what money is going to be, as if money is just another commodity on the market. All right, but it's like, if it's just another commodity on the market, what are you using it to, what do you use to buy it with? All right, what do you price it in? You're pricing it in US dollars, right? So it's like, do you authentically think these are actually currencies, or are these just commodities on a US dollar denominated market?
Yeah, so first question, kind of what is inflation? So within the context of this, I refer to kind of long run inflation, not any sort of short-term idiosyncratic event, but like perpetual inflation, which I think kind of in the long run reduces your purchasing power. I kind of, in the long run, those equate to the same thing. With regard to the second thought of like, we price these things in US dollars now, like will they ever be money things? That's less clear. Like arguing, like the Bitcoin maximalists would be like, no, like on a long enough time scale, like the Federal Reserve and the US dollar are like going away and stuff. That seems pretty far-fetched. It seems like the governments that are powerful, that have all the guns and like control the global bank systems, like it's pretty stupid to argue that they're gonna go away anytime soon. But like we're gonna see this pretty weird dichotomy in like 10 years where there's gonna be sectors of the world, like in Argentina, Venezuela, whatever, where like the government has kind of sort of collapsed and people are like actually using crypto to transact like food and like commerce and stuff. And like I don't know what those countries are gonna do in terms of like public infrastructure and governments, like that's a big problem. But then like the US is gonna like have a stable US dollar. And so like it's gonna be weird. You're gonna have parts of the world where I think will use these systems as currency, and then parts that like you're not gonna displace US dollars and euros. So like projecting any further than that I think is like not reasonable. You don't know. But like you will see weak countries, this will be this will challenge the legitimacy of weak countries, and you will see normal consumers using crypto to buy food on the street at mass, I think in the next 5 years in places where the government does not serve the needs of the people.
I just had a quick question, just based on the last thing you said. So if these governments collapse, don't you think that stronger governments will come in, sort of like what you're seeing with Syria, where you have this vacuum, and stronger governments are going to come in, and then, you know, let's say America, whatever, comes in. Wouldn't the US dollar then sort of replace it and maybe be the competitor to the crypto, use of what they're doing?
I have no idea. I am not an expert in like how to overthrow governments and like studying revolutions and government change. I have no fucking clue. What I do know is that like the US government is like, okay, like let's say Argentine government collapses, like US tries to step in and save some stuff. Like getting the infrastructure in place to like accept US dollars everywhere and have both the paper dollars and the electronic dollars is like going to be very difficult for that to happen quickly, just because like the US controls US dollars. But like with crypto, it's like, oh yeah, well there's some Zcash and I have some private money now, and like I downloaded this client off the internet and like now it works, right? And like that will be true. And so there's like, I think the like discrepancy between how hard it will be for the people to adopt, like clearly favors crypto, because crypto is just self-sovereign, download some software, you're ready to go. So, we'll see kind of how the market plays out, but like I don't expect the Federal Reserve to be nimble and like enabling the people of Argentina to get US dollars. That seems unlikely, that the US will really do a good job of like making that happen.
We're going to do 2 more questions, then break for lunch.
I was just kind of curious among the people here, kind of see a show of hands. You broke it down into sound money versus utility versus a stable coin versus I just haven't decided yet. It'd just be kind of interesting to see a show of hands of like which camp everybody finds themselves to be in now. So, if I may, who's with sound money? Who's with utility? Who's with stability? And how many undecideds? That seems like way more than 100% of the hands went up.
This is a question about with Bitcoin being
Can you talk closer to the mic?
With Bitcoin being so volatile in terms of its pricing, people are a little skeptical. Do you see if we have more currencies competing against one another, whether it's utility or Litecoin, Ripple, whatever, do you see that as a way to compete and stabilize prices? So it would be a better thing for the market for more people to create different types of currencies?
So the question is like, what is the impact of competition among currencies on the market and on prices? So in the short run, like one of the funny things with capitalism is the capitalism is massively inefficient because you have like tons and tons of people rebuilding the same thing, competing against each other. So that's like very inefficient at like a top-down view of the world. but like on a bottoms-up view, it turns out like very few people know the right answers to basically anything. And so like just let people compete, and like eventually someone will find the right answer. So like in the short run, it's very inefficient to have all these people competing, because like they're like all sucking money and talent and like attention away from one another, and that's kind of value destructive. The problem is that we just don't know what the right answers are, and so this is the only way to get to basically discovery of like what is the right answer. So I view competition long run healthy, short run unhealthy.
Cool. Hand for Kyle.